I am the one that has the honor actually to be a part of a second run at CCGI, talking about public procurement, which is, as you would well imagine, is a matter that I like to think about quite a lot. I love the fact that you give me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on public procurement issues, and in particular today's theme, understanding challenges in public sector procurement. It's refreshing to know that people came here to listen rather than my friends whom I often force to listen to me. And my only regret is that I am stuck here in Jamaica and not there with you guys in Trinidad, which is one of my favorite places to be. Now, for those who have not heard me before, I'm just going to give you a fair warning that I plan to say very inconvenient things, but hopefully they're thought-provoking things. So I'm just going to go into starting this presentation, and I'm going to share my screen so you can follow me on PowerPoint. Just 1 second. All right, for some reason, my PowerPoint isn't coming up.
Okay, yeah, for me too, somehow doesn't open. Right, so
I found it.
Screen button.
Yeah, I've got it. All right. So the topic we have today is a big one, and there is no way to conveniently package all of the thoughts that I'd like to share. And so what I did in preparing for today's presentation was to sort of set a large framework of thoughts under which we can fit all of the major considerations. And I am really excited about the other sessions that are going to happen today, because each of them, I believe, will pick up on certain themes that I plan to discuss this morning. So first of all, we know what public procurement is. Public procurement is the acquisition of goods, services, and works that are required by an individual. Well, procurement is the acquisition of goods, services, or works required by an individual or organization. Public procurement, therefore, describes the government's use of taxpayer dollars to purchase contracts for goods, services, and works that are required to deliver services to citizens. And these goods, works, and services are obtained from economic operators who trade in the free local, regional, and international markets. Now, it is true that private sector suppliers, these economic operators that we just spoke about, they have historically played an important role in government operations. As a matter of fact, Tom Holland records for us that in 133 BC, and that's before Christ, not before COVID, the Roman Senate, in its management of the Greek city of Pergamum, actually outsourced tax collection services to brave, and I dare say generally evil, tax collection firms and tax collectors. The Senate invited these private contractors, called publicans, to openly bid for contracts to supply tax collection services. And then the contracts were awarded exclusively to those tax collectors, those bidders, who could guarantee the maximum collections or returns for government. These tax funds were eventually used to undertake the large public construction and development projects, together with the provision of basic state services. Now, the record also shows, and if anybody is up to date on biblical history, maybe some Sunday school lesson from sometime in the past, you might remember a certain short-statured tax collector called Zacchaeus, who had to climb up into a sycamore tree in order to see Jesus, who was passing by. No, this is not a sermon. I'm getting somewhere with this. The interesting thing is that, Zacchaeus, short though he was, also didn't want to mix too much with the crowd, because Zacchaeus was a wicked man. In Jamaica, we'd call him a thief, right? And tax collectors generally were thieves. Now, these tax collectors, under the power of the state, were unleashed upon the public. And I say unleashed because what followed was the greatest abuse of state power and state authority known to the times. With the force of the state, the collectors would often demand from the public way more taxes than were actually levied by the Roman government. What they did, therefore, was they paid over what was contractually due, and then they kept for themselves the balance. So they retained for themselves the net benefit of the pilferage. And the record shows that it was not uncommon for these tax collectors to use force in their extraction of money from even the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. Now, folks, it appeared to the Romans that these kinds of contracts were likely the most effective for the tax revenue measures that the Roman Senate had set out to achieve. Firstly, the Romans were occupying this Greek territory and not there as welcome guests, but rather as colonizers. In that context, it was not likely that citizens would voluntarily pay taxes to a state they resented. Secondly, because it was likely the most efficient strategy from a human resource point of view. There was no point in keeping tax collectors employed to the government when there were these firms and these services who were specialized in collecting taxes. And then thirdly, these tax collectors were notoriously good at their jobs. Revenue performance increased year on year. And if you know anything about Pergamum, it was one of the wealthiest places in the world at the time, because not only because of the endowment of natural resources, but because the government was able to extract a lot of those resources and deploy them for their benefit and to some extent for the benefit of the country. And then, as I said, they got very, very interested and they did very well in infrastructure development. So the Romans ran Pergamum very well. And a part of the running of Pergamum very well was the use of these procurement contracts for tax collection services. Now, here's the problem. With our 21st century understanding of exactly how dastardly human beings can be, it is clear to us that this whole enterprise was quite frankly nuts. First and most obvious, the concentration of state power in the hands of a few agents without robust laws to ensure that that power is not abused was problematic. It's bound to create a moral hazard and ultimately will result in the subversion of government aims. Secondly, as to the procurement contracts themselves, there was no way to transparently or sensibly determine whether the promised returns were well within the range of possible values and therefore proportionate to the government's expectations. So in other words, what that ended up being was a license to go and pilfer, because there was no way to adequately check that what these tax collectors were promising was sensible. So government lost again. And then thirdly, in relation to the market, because the bidding process was so open and transparent, in fact, what they did, that picture on your screen is a picture of the Roman Forum. And that was the seat of business in Rome. And even though we're talking about services in Pergamum, a lot of these tax collectors would actually gather there in that forum, all of them together to bid subsequently on these contracts. Now, what that meant is that you gave them the opportunity to come together and to collude. And therefore, they could determine amongst themselves how much they were going to sort of offer to the government, whether that's low or high, right? And there was no way the government could check, because this was what, as far as they were concerned, the market response. So the whole enterprise of placing that procurement contract was, I mean, just nuts. And the entire thing is just, it just don't make any sense, right? Now, this aspect of the Roman experience exemplifies in some ways the mystery that is public procurement. For in large measure, as I said, the contracts were effective. Tax revenues increased and the state was functioning well. The problem was that in the pursuit of one set of aims or one set of goals, significant governance and public policy issues arose, eventually impairing the function of the state. I mean, the Romans were to lose the state shortly after to the Ottomans, sorry, and then rose the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so what was happening was that in pursuing a lot of high fiscal goals, governance and public policy issues arose. And against this example, Dr. Thomas Sowell, in his book, A Conflict of Visions, Ideological Origins of Political Struggles, provides to us a gem, which I would like to adopt for the thesis of this brief presentation. And I hope I can hold your interest for about 20 more minutes. And it is this: there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And you try to get the best trade-off you can get. Okay? This is really the heart of the challenge or the challenges that we face in public sector procurement. You see, understanding challenges in public sector procurement demands recognition and reflection on the fact that procurement systems are built to achieve multiple objectives that are at once mutually reinforcing and interdependent, but just messy. Therefore, navigating this complex space is made all the more difficult by the fact that most citizens judge the integrity of their governments by the performance of the public procurement system. Governments must therefore devise appropriate methods to assist the often well-intentioned, even though highly fatigued government workers to pursue the best of the trade-offs in a manner that is discernibly sound and in every way defensible. What then are these complex trade-offs, and how do we configure public procurement systems to make these trade-offs well? Okay, well, the first one is the trade-off between pursuing operational constraints over contracting efficiency. All right, and this one hits at the heart of procurement practitioners who are in the room, who every single day face some of the things that I'm about to discuss. Now, here's what's going on. Pryor and others argue eloquently that it's always difficult to make these operational trade-offs versus efficiency, because while economic efficiency can often be measured in monetary terms, it remains unclear how to measure the cost of transparency or other operational fetters on discretion that are meant to distort information asymmetry. Notwithstanding, we are confident, and we know for sure, that any attempt to institutionalize control processes often results in procurement practitioners electing to reduce procurement to filling out forms, to insisting on the filling out of forms which are viewed by others, rather than making sensible procurement decisions in the overall best interest of the country. The problem with this culture is that procurement decision makers shift the meaning of accountability from the broad and arguably relevant connotation of prudence, etc., to blind compliance, thereby subverting the aims of the system and the process as a whole. And this culture, therefore, makes it entirely possible to do a fantastic job at purchasing poorly. You can buy the best in the best possible way, but end up with the worst possible contract. And so if we're not careful about making appropriate trade-offs at the appropriate times, we are failures in our own right. So practically, the kind of case that we're talking about here is the all too common situation where an extremely diligent procurement officer prefers to overlook the low but demonstrably capable bidder to make a recommendation to award a procurement contract to the next bidder, whose price is, for the sake of argument, 10% higher than the average of all the bids and 17% higher than the low bidder's bid, simply because the low bidder did not sign all the pages of the bid, as directed in instruction 8.1.2, right? So what we have here is a sort of culture that prioritizes form over substance. Now, there is nothing impeachable about the low bidder. In fact, the low bidder may very well appear on a national register and is capable of providing the subject matter, but he has made a mistake And that mistake is that he has not signed all the pages of the bid. Now, is that material or not? And the question is it worth 17% to the people? Okay? Should the people of Trinidad and Tobago, or the people of Jamaica, or the people of this Caribbean region pay 17% more for the subject matter of the contract because somebody failed to initial the pages of a bid? It could be worth that, but often it's not. And therefore, having reviewed volumes of case law and presided over many procurement decisions myself, I believe that the following are useful in helping with this trade-off. Number one, in our procurement rules, we have to reserve discretion to appropriate authorities to overlook minor or immaterial deviations from tendering requirements. Very, very important. Otherwise, we become box tickers and paper pushers rather than being capable and empowered to make sensible decisions in the public interest. Then secondly, we need to develop a culture of rejecting bids on merit rather than throwing bids out because of these minor or immaterial deviations. So the second point is connected to the first, but it's slightly different. And then the third thing is that procurement people need to be incentivized to spend well. Procurement people need to be incentivized to spend well. They need to know that there is a reward tangibly for them at the end of the day when they make good decisions in the government's interest. And that reward could be, better salaries, profit share, if you're in an agency that earns profits, etc. Whatever that is, procurement people have to be incentivized. So the first trade-off is the trade-off between, how important are these operational constraints versus contracting efficiency. And I am suggesting that since there are no solutions, these are some of the things that we can consider in relation to making those trade-offs. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, and you try to get the best trade-off you can get. Okay, so the second trade-off that we need to think about is the trade-off between rigor and time efficiency. Okay, so everybody knows that procurement takes too long, right? Even though I am often personally amused by the non-responses of persons when I asked, well, compared to what? And what's the cost of improving it? Notwithstanding, public sector time efficiency generally is a problem and is often amplified in the context of public procurement. Now, the reality is that precision and comprehensiveness in procurement is necessary, not only for the sake of transparency and associated issues, but also for the sake of attaining value for money. However, on this issue, most governments and procurement departments avoid sensible and proportionate decisions or procedures that are contextually sound and purpose-driven. And this results in an increase in the time it takes to achieve the required goals. I said a while ago that governments and departments have not been making sensible and proportionate decisions. I want to pick up on this thing about proportionality. Proportionality, as a legal concept, finds its home in European Union law, but it's slowly making its way into domestic legislation. And in fact, my review of Trinidad's legislation is that it is an implied principle, because the only way to achieve some of the objectives that you have set out in Trinidad, and I believe also in Guyana, is to take on board this concept of proportionality. Proportionality means that a condition or requirement is proportional or proportionate if it is appropriate and necessary. A condition or requirement is appropriate if it facilitates achieving the intended purpose, and it is necessary when the same purpose cannot be achieved through some other less onerous means. The principle therefore calls for decision makers to avoid cookie cutter procedures or conditions in the context that the subject matter being procured is differentiated and of varying degrees of risk and complexity. So an example of the types of measures that fall to be discussed under this head may be found in certain domestic procurement legislation in this very region. I would identify the legislation that I'm making reference to, but I'm minded that this session is being recorded and I don't want to get into any trouble. So I will make it imprecise, but just to say that in this particular piece of legislation, there is this concept called standstill, okay? Now, standstill is a period of 10 days that a procuring entity must wait before it awards a contract. And during this period, an aggrieved supplier or aggrieved bidder may challenge the exercise of the procuring entity's discretion. May say, no, you have done wrong. You said, this is how we're going to get points, and I complied with that, and you've not appropriately exercised your discretion. So it's pursuing fairness and transparency in the process. Now, here's what's going on in this legislation. Standstill is meant to apply to every single government contract. Talk about disproportionate. So what we have is a contract for, say, $100 TT, right? I don't know how much that is in Jamaican, right? Being exposed to the same standstill that a contract for $100 billion TT would be exposed to. Clearly, a contract for $100 TT in relation to the level of rigor and effort that must be put into that contract is far less than a contract for $100 billion. So the requirements, both in the domestic legislation and in the rules that support the procurement proceedings, have to be proportionate to the value. Otherwise, you're going to end up wasting time, all for the sake of being able to demonstrate that you did a good and comprehensive job. It's total nonsense. Now, it's foolhardy of me not to underscore that swinging the pendulum to the opposite extreme would be problematic. Really, the procedures and conditions and requirements in public procurement are often set out to ensure high degrees of transparency and competition, and there is no tolerance in public procurement for procedures that do not achieve these things. Okay, so there are some procuring entities that are extremely time efficient, but they achieve their so-called success by procuring from single sources. I heard Kamla mention earlier sole select tenders. It's a problem. It's a problem, first of all, because relying on a single source is economically inefficient. Okay? It also exposes you to risk. Now, in a well-run free market for trade in goods and services, the element of competition in procurement incentivizes economic operators to offer their best combination of price and quality, thereby earning for themselves a profitable contract and allowing the government to demonstrate prudence in spend. Additionally, competition requirements are established to protect the institution of competition in its own right. That is to say, the government's participation in the economy should not result in the formation of dominant firms who could then abuse their dominance and distort the functioning of the market. So competition is really, really important. So we're not talking now about swinging the pendulum away from competition, away from procedures, away from conditions. We're talking about being reasonable. I'm very interested to hear about the lecture that's coming up on the sole select tenders and the situation in Trinidad. I'm going to be keenly listening to that. Okay, so how do we sort of help to balance these things, and how do we help to make the trade-offs? So the first of all is we have to become really good at evaluating risk in contracting, and therefore deploy conditions that face those risks. Really important. In other words, just because somebody bought that thing the other day using those documents doesn't mean that those conditions and requirements that were set out in those documents are applicable in your organization. Or because you did it this way last year means that this is the way that it must be done this year. Procurement people need to become really, really good at understanding risk. What are the aims that government and your entity are trying to achieve, and how can you therefore enable the achievement of these aims? You have to look at the things that could go wrong, and then those things that could go wrong, those things are your risks. then you therefore set out conditions to face those risks and mitigate and minimize them. All right. So when we're thinking about proportional or proportionate contracting, we're thinking about making risk assessments and therefore deploying requirements that face those risks. And then at the domestic level or at the national level, we could use or deploy rules that establish that contracts are different and that therefore for certain value contracts, there are certain differences in the procedures associated with procuring those contracts. And I think if you do that, you open the space for far more time-efficient decisions, okay? So persons are able now to select procedures that are fitting for the value of the contract that they are going to place. But I'm not advancing for this, I'm not advocating, for this cookie cutter approach right across the board. It doesn't make sense, right? If we're going to make sense of these trade-offs, we have to think about what we're doing and be smart. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And you try to get the best trade-off that you can get. Well, the third sort of trade-off that I want to talk about, and the final for those who are falling asleep, is this pursuit of horizontal goals over value and efficiency. So here's what's going on. Government is a big spender, and government spends anywhere from 15 to 40% of gross domestic product in procurement markets. Now, this implies that government could deploy the procurement function to achieve social and environmental goals that go beyond the subject matter of the procurement. So, for example, government could say it's set out to procure pens. This pen is from Trinidad, by the way. So government could say it's set out to procure pens, okay? But instead of buying pens alone, it says, well, we want to buy socially responsible pens. So we want to buy pens from firms who can demonstrate that all along the supply chain in the manufacturing of this pen, everybody was paid fairly. So it's a fair trade pen. Or government could say, you know what? All of these pens that you use contribute to environmental degradation when you dispose of them because of the material they're made of. So we want to make pens that are environmentally friendly. All right. So they must be made of certain materials and so on and so forth, so that when they're discarded, they don't have environmental impact. So that's what we're talking about, these horizontal goals. Now, the flavor that this normally takes in our region and in many regions across the world really is more for social goals. So government may say in our public procurement space, we are going to incentivize small and medium-sized enterprises to participate in public procurement, or women-owned businesses. In South Africa, they've got Black-owned enterprises as one of the chief aims, okay? So this is what we're talking about, horizontal goals being pursued in public procurement. Now, the issue, I mean, all of us would agree that these are good things, that attaining these goals are good things. Government wants to do that. I know Trinidad is very keen on that. The problem is that you run the risk in this particular trade-off of diminishing value and efficiency for the sake of achieving these horizontal objectives. Okay, so what do I mean? Well, we all know that contracting efficiency includes aggregating your volumes, yeah, and then leveraging that higher lot for better price and for stimulating more competitive and specialized firms to grow in that particular industry, okay? But if we're going to pursue horizontal goals in relation to like SMEs and smaller firms, what it means is that we have to unbundle those lots and therefore procure multiple different contracts, which is administratively burdensome, and then you lose the benefit of negotiating on the aggregated lot. Okay, so that's problematic, right? It's a problem because you can't prove that doing that is actually better overall for the government's long-term interest than aggregating and negotiating. In fact, if you talk to the man on the street may very well tell you that he prefers if he gets a break on the price rather than procuring all of these multiple contracts. Very, very important, very, very interesting. So, and in including SMEs and so on, also sometimes government is called upon to make concessions in relation to the contract conditions that would normally protect government. So bringing SMEs into the fold means giving them the ultimate set of circumstances for them to thrive and for them to earn the contracts. But that may also mean that government may have to say, okay, well, in these contracts, we're not going to be as strict on certain things. And that has many, many problems. First of all, it could become really, really ineffective, right? So those contracts could end up not achieving the aims that they were set out to do in the first place. It could become less valuable because it may mean having to accept something of lower quality just because you want to facilitate the SME. And it also could mean less efficiency. So how do you therefore get these goals balanced out, right? The first thing is that in domestic legislation, you have to establish procedures that don't allow for acceptance of low or subpar performance, okay? And that might imply that procuring entities on their own or as initiatives of government may have to go out and upskill and capacitate these suppliers in relation to their supply to government. And then secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is that in relation to these disadvantaged economic actors, you have to take a multi-sectoral approach, right? So it can't just be about using the procurement function to help them out. You also have to, use development funding. You have to give them access to certain resources. You have to upskill them in relation to their technical and financial capacity. And in doing so, you bring them into a place of higher competitiveness, and therefore your overall aim as government doesn't get subverted. So, folks, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I'm sure if you think about the three main things that we looked at, pursuing contracting efficiency over operational constraints, pursuing rigor over speed, pursuing horizontal policies over value and efficiency, all of the problems that we face on a day-to-day basis could fit under those categories. Now, the question is, how do we approach the problems as they arise? And I think if you listen to the considerations and the recommendations that I've made, you might start well on a path to success. Thank you for listening. I apologize if you fell asleep. It's all Kamla's fault, but I'm open now for questions and comments.
I could tell you, Andrei, I found that the contribution was absolutely fascinating. And I know a lot of the students who are doing procurement studies right now would similarly have found a lot of the points you made extremely interesting, because these are the kinds of rigor that we are going through for SIPs. But I want, before we open up the floor to question and answers, our chairman of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute is with us. So I wanted to give him an opportunity to say a few words of welcome. Well, hopefully, is Nigel still with us?
I'm here.
Oh, okay, right, there we are. Yes, and I know that you've been listening to Andrei, so you can open the button for the Q&A part now.
No, I want to thank Andrei for a very stimulating presentation. I think you hit the nail on the head. There are no solutions, only options. And I mean, I'm a private sector guy. I find the public sector very trying, let's put it that way, because the bureaucracy ties us up and gets in the way of getting to the kinds of results we could achieve if people were more creative, if people were more focused on the right outcomes as opposed to ticking the boxes and the process. Having said that, it's the public sector, and you have the challenges of people not being focused or not being invested really in getting the best for the stakeholder. So I'll shut up and I'll be interested in hearing the questions, but that's the trade-off that we have to ultimately have to deal with. Giving, for me, it's, I mean, I've just finished reading Reed Hastings' book, the founder and CEO of Netflix. And the name of the book is No Rules, Rules. I mean, Netflix does not operate based on rules. It operates based on freedom and responsibility. Now, if you mess up and in a corrupt sense, you're gone. Unfortunately, with the public service, we don't have that flexibility. We don't have that to find a way to move us closer to that is going to be a challenge. But that's the real trade-off we face. Getting people invested in what is best for the electorate, what is best for the citizenry, as opposed to ticking the boxes and ensuring that they are covered, if you will. But let me shut up and listen to some of the questions. I'm sure there are
Thank you so much,
but
Michael.
excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes. So we do have two comments in the chat feature. One just came in. So let me just scroll back up to get the two. The first is from Joycelyn Thomas Vialmosa. And she said the presentation was thought-provoking and it enables us to adjust our expectations and focus on realistic goals. And also from Alec Babwa, he says, most interested in getting the value of procurement activities in public sector transferred to the delivery to the citizens of the country. Now, I would like to ask a question directly, Andrei, before I go there. Two other comments, but I was particularly impressed with this point you made with respect to government also looking at social procurement issues, because that is something we are more familiar with in the private sector because it's so important to protect the reputation of the organization. And for that reason, you will pay attention to the supply chain line to ensure that you have some of those social issues dealt with. But it's quite an interesting thought that government too should go down this road because it's the right thing to do. When at the same time, just as you said, the citizen, the average citizen, really is more focused on how can I get the best price. So can you give us any examples of where government has been able to really straddle both those objectives to say, okay, let's get some efficiency in here because we want to get the best price to our consumers, but where government has taken this direct line of saying all suppliers in this chain must meet the minimum expectations in terms of fair wages and not using child labor and all those many concerns that we continue to have.
Okay, so you asked for examples, right, Kamala? The best examples we have of this are in the European Union, and it's a total mess. Okay, now the EU market integration project aims to ensure that there's a single internal market for goods and services, right? And so a lot of the rules and principles that are attached to the functioning of the market and in particular the function of government procurement aim to ensure that there's no discrimination, that people and goods and services can move freely, etc., etc. On top of that, in the 2014 directive, the Europeans now started to do exactly what we're talking about by asking governments, by asking member states to now start to pursue these horizontal goals. And they set out in the directives the ways that they could achieve them. So You could include horizontal conditions in your technical specifications. You could include them as contract performance clauses. You could include them as qualification information. Here is the issue. Nobody knows how to do it, when to do it, and in many cases, why they should do it. Okay? And it's a point I wanted to make, but I didn't find it convenient to fit it into the main part of the presentation, is that what we severely lack in relation to these trade-offs that we have to make is leadership, right? So at the end of the day, somebody has to make a decision about how these things are supposed to work, all right? And I find that generally people don't make those decisions, or they're afraid to make those decisions. We need leadership. And I suppose then a part of getting it right in procurement, a part of getting the answers is to put the people who are designed to lead us in a position where they have to make choices about which one of these things is more important than the other. I suppose for many political and other reasons, people they're afraid to do that, because at the end of the day, there are other considerations that are made when deploying these, when pursuing public leadership. But I don't have good examples. I don't have success stories. The case law in the European Union and in parts of Canada is rife with challenges on this matter, right? So it's good. It's a good idea. It's just that nobody knows how to do it. So in Jamaica, right, we've got these preference policies. I can tell you how ours work, and we're it's quite nascent. So maybe next year when you invite me back, I could share some some results. So we have a scheme where we set aside 20% of government contracts for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. What we do is we follow the United States federal acquisition regulations, and we use competitions that are only for MSMEs, right? So once the procuring entity is satisfied that there are at least 2 capable MSMEs that are able to supply the goods or services or works, at least 2, then the competition is run only between those 2, and so however as many as are there. Okay, so what that does is that it causes the SMEs to feel empowered to participate in the process, knowing that they're not up against the Goliaths and the giants. And it also preserves the element of competition for the sake of transparency and integrity. So that's how we do ours. It's nascent. We don't know how it will work. What it does mean, though, is that if at the end of the MSME only competition, we can't identify someone to go to contract with, then we have to put the lot out to the market publicly. And that therefore wastes time and drives administrative costs. So, we don't know how it will turn out. We don't know how we'll measure the effectiveness of the policy, but that's how we are approaching it here in Jamaica. Hope that helps.
Okay. Well, it certainly does. It's thought-provoking for us to know these are aspirations we should all have, but we need to find, to make it happen. There are a couple of questions in from Daya in particular, but I want to go first to one from Brent Ramtume, because it picks up directly where you just left off. And he asks, can you tell us a little on the organizational structure and the reporting lines of the procurement office in Jamaica?
Okay, in Jamaica, our procurement is purely decentralized, okay? And Kamala mentioned earlier, I think Trinidad has a similar model. So the responsibility for procurement decisions falls in the procuring entities, of which there are 198, made up of ministries, departments, and agencies. So it is the head of these procurement or procuring entities that's accountable for all procurement decisions, all right? Now, we have a very complex setup here in Jamaica. So even though the responsibility is reposed in the head of the procuring entity, for contracts in certain thresholds, the approval of those contracts awards have to be made through very circuitous routes. So there is an institutional procurement committee in every procurement department or procuring entity, and that procurement committee does pretty much overlooks the work of the procurement officer. Then the head of entity, if there's a contract for 30 million Jamaican dollars or more, but less than 60 million, 30 to 60, that contract award has to be approved by a body that's set out by the law known as the Public Procurement Commission. So the Public Procurement Commission does two things. It registers suppliers for participation in Jamaica's procurement market, and it also approves contract awards for contracts 30 million to 60 million Jamaican. I don't know what that is in TT dollars, but I suspect it's substantially less, okay? And then for contracts that are $60 million and above, those contracts are endorsed by the procuring entity, endorsed by the Public Procurement Commission, and then sent on to Cabinet via a subcommittee of Cabinet known as the Infrastructure Committee, and then those decisions are ratified by the full body of the Cabinet. So for Jamaica to spend $60,100,000, right? It usually results, or it usually means that about 61 people have to look at the contract award recommendation and say that it's okay. And obviously, we assume that each higher tier in that group of 61, each higher tier is more responsible and more honest than the tier below. So, which is why we include more and more oversight for these contracts. So we're largely decentralized, but final procurement decisions are not made for certain contracts above 30 million in the decentralized procurement centers.
Okay, Brent, did that answer your question properly enough for you? Do you have a follow-up?
I have a follow-up for Andrei. Do you review the decision? Is there a review process that says, let's look at the decisions that were made to ascertain that the best outcomes were the result?
Right. So we have two institutions of the state. One is the Integrity Commission, which is a body made up of people full of integrity who look at almost all the decisions that are made in public contracting, whether in procurement or disposal of assets, etc. Okay. Now they have wide powers under the law to initiate investigations into any matter that they so desire. And they send requisitions and you have to comply with them or face being thrown into jail. So there is that body, the Integrity Commission. And then there's the Office of the Auditor General, who reviews, who conducts post-audit exercises with remarkable frequency, right? And then she lays reports on the table of Parliament, which are then looked at by a Public Accounts and Appropriations Committee. And the outcomes of those investigations are usually publicized and had on national television so that everybody can see what is going on in these public procurement contracts. Whole heap of institutional oversight. We also have the major organized crime and anti-corruption division that's also empowered to look into corrupt decisions, including procurement decisions. And then in our own right, in our process, we have a procurement review board, and that board is a quasi-judicial tribunal that actually hears complaints from aggrieved bidders who may say, well, you know, the exercise of the discretion was inappropriate. Whole heap of oversight.
Okay, so I just want to present a comment from Dorian Dyer, who I think is with the Ministry of Public Administration. So coming from the private sector for over 20 years, I had a major culture shock when I tried to do public procurement. I saw this is the way it has to be done, box ticks in firsthand. But those in the position to change that approach to a more common sense one is not willing. What do we do? And then there was a follow-up question which said, how do we deal with the trade-off of value for money versus lowest cost, which seems to be the de facto position for public procurement? This is particularly important in technology services where for a few dollars more, one could get a far better service, but it's not the lowest cost. That's questions from Dorian.
Let me take question one first. You said, you recognize that this is the way it has to be done. No, there is no such thing, right? And I think this is why I often got frustrated with government. It's whenever you ask a question, why do we do the things that we do? There is never a good answer. So here's my strategy. If I can't get a sensible answer to the question, why is it done that way, then I don't do it that way. Okay? Now, you might say, but Andrei, there are laws and there are these guidelines and everything. All of these things are subject to interpretation. And what happens often in government is that you interpret these things in the most restrictive way. That's not commerce enabling. You will never get anything done if all you see is constraint, right? You actually need to get business done. If you have a slate of 15 contracts that need to be placed in 3 months, you have to find a way to get it done, okay? So this is the way it's done. This is the way we do it. This is how it's done here. That's total nonsense. Challenge it all the time. Okay, and if them fire you, come to Jamaica. We have a place for you. All right. So that's the first one.
So Andrei, let me just jump in there, because I tell people all the time that there are no stupid questions.
Yes.
But there are 2 stupid answers, and those answers you just gave are the 2 stupid answers. And the reason they're stupid answers, that's not how we do it here. We have never done it like that before. It's because they shut down learning. They shut down growth and improvement. So thank you for sharing it.
No problem. So on the second question about trade-offs between value for money and lowest cost, I don't actually think that's a trade-off, okay? Because there are times that the lowest cost could represent value for money. Now that's if we're considering cost to be a total life cycle cost or a total cost of ownership, okay? But let me step back a little bit and go back to a definitional concern. Value for money is not the lowest price. Let's start there. It's 3 things. 2 of them are implied in the solicitation process and 1 before. The first thing is that the goods, works, or services that are procured are adequate. That means that they're not over-specified, nor are they under-specified. Very important. Government is not in the business of buying Mercedes if a Toyota can do the job, without prejudice to the owners of Mercedes, right? So we don't buy the most luxurious things if something else that is cheaper can do the same job. But at the same time, we don't buy a bicycle if we need a car, right? And it is understanding that tension from the planning stage that helps with specifying our requirements adequately. In technology, oh my goodness. The problem with tech people is that tech people always want you to buy ahead of the curve, which may very well be a proper strategy, but government often can't afford it, okay? So, I mean, I understand the question from that perspective. Okay, so it's adequate. The second thing is that value for money means that you buy the thing at the most commercially advantageous terms. Okay, so that's where procurement people actually need to focus, is what are the terms in the marketplace? How do we actually do these, get these things done in the market generally? And procurement people must go and research those things and then put packages together that ask for offers on the basis of those most advantageous terms, right? And then thirdly, value for money means buying from the capable suppliers, right? So you get value for money when you buy from a supplier who has a proven track record. That's not to say that you can't contract with somebody who is new in the game, but you have to be careful, right? So I think if you look at the definitional debate in that way, then you could see that there's actually no tension between value for money and lowest price or lowest cost, because lowest cost could actually achieve all of those things. But at the same time, the lowest price could be totally out of proportion with achieving value for money. And so I think about VFM in that way and explain it like that to the people who you are doing work for, and I think you should be fine.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Andrei. So I see Robbie has his hand up. Let me ask Robbie if he wants to unmute and make his comment and ask question.
Morning again. Morning, Nigel.
Good morning, Robbie.
Andrei, good hearing you again and good connecting.
Robbie.
It's impressive as always, I must say. I have two questions. You spoke about standstill. That's after the award, before signing of contract. And you were referring that the disparity in value of the same 10 days. What's your recommendation? And my second question, you spoke about immaterial rejection of bids. Let's look at a generic evaluation criteria, just a standard one. What are criteria you believe should not waver at no time? I mean, I totally agree with you. Signing a document is immaterial. That can be corrected, but what are stuff like in Guyana? Two things we don't play with. Two of several others, but they are the compliance. There are tax compliance and your insurance compliance. From your, what other documentation you think should not waver from a generic perspective? I don't want to go into too lengthy about the list of criteria. Thank you.
Okay, so question number one was, well, Andrei, you clearly have an issue with standstill. I mean, how do you think it should be deployed? You know, I think there are some commercially significant contracts that, and certainly at and above certain values, that should attract a standstill, okay? That might be different in every country. So in our context, I mean, honestly, my impression is that a contract for less than 30 million Jamaican dollars should not be subject to any standstill, okay? A procuring entity should be able to go forth and procure that. I don't know how much that is in Trinidadian dollars, right? But, you know, 30 million and below, you just go on contract. Nobody cares. I mean, yeah, people do care, but the administrative effort in deploying the standstill and accepting queries and concerns from bidders and so on for $30 million contract is disproportionate to the value of the contract. Okay, that's as far as I can see. That's really what I think. I certainly don't think that standstill should apply to every single contract, which is what we have here in Jamaica. It shouldn't. Hope that helps. So maybe you could work out 30 million in Guyanese dollars and
give us it in the US equivalent, and then everybody who is listening throughout the region
could do okay. So
all right, and
that's about 214,000 US dollars, right? That is my fee. That's my impression. About $200,000 and above. That's when you include these administrative controls. The second question was about, well, what is immaterial and what is material? Robbie, if the thing doesn't affect the price and quality of the offer, if it affects the government's protections or varies the obligations of the bidder in a way that's not acceptable in the contract, or if you can't fix it without prejudicing another bidder, it's material. All right. So if it affects the price and quality of the offer, if it takes away government protections and diminishes the obligations of the supplier, and if fixing it would mean disadvantaging and prejudicing some other bidder, then it's material. All right. Otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, it's fair game. So in Jamaica, for example, right? you have these conditions in the solicitation documents that require the filling out of qualification forms and other forms that provide information to the procuring entity. Information that is in the public domain, on the supplier's website, or already in the registry, because we have a registry here. Yet still, procuring entities throw suppliers out for incorrectly filling out the forms. It don't make sense. You talk about tax compliance and so on. Recently, this office, right, issued an opinion on a matter to do with the incorrect tax compliance certificate that was put into a tender package. And here's what we've said. We've said that tax compliance and public procurement commission certifications are things that are issued by the government, okay? So the government has already said that you are certified and you're tax compliant. Why is the government now saying, you having made a mistake, why is the government now saying that your mistake is so egregious after we don't certify you, we don't say tax compliant? In other words, government already has the information. So if government has the information and is sure that you are certified, is sure that you're tax compliant, then why throw the bidder out when you can go to the government department and get the information? It don't make sense. Reject bids on merit, man. If the thing don't make sense, if it's not going to fit your organizational needs, reject it. But the other things around the contractual and formal requirements, I mean, I don't mean to play loosey-goosey with those, but just be careful about what you stipulate, and then also don't hold them to be more material than they need to be. That's my recommendation.
Andrei, just a little follow-up. So I like the point that you made about the compliance. So in Guyana, one of the criteria for bidding, you have to submit your annual financial statement, maybe 3 years back. So then you are right. Now, actually, I'm going to be honest, now that I give it some thought, it doesn't make any sense because you already issued the tax compliance. Yes, thank you, man. I think I'll be fighting hard like you at this end.
Yes. All right, so we have a couple questions in the chat. One of them, Andrei, we're going to kind of put you on the spot to assess this a little bit. It's a question from Kay Baldev Singh Arjun, and she wanted you to give, if you had to rate your office in terms of, let me go back and find the question exactly, right? How would you rate the system as it's working in Jamaica with respect to oversight? If you had to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10.
Okay, let me answer it this way, all right? In terms of institutions, 10 out of 10, right? In terms of audit frequency and, the power of the institutions, 10 out of 10. In terms of the approach, the professional approach to oversight, 10 out of 10. But here's what we have going on. We have a situation where the operation was successful, but the patient died. Because, even with all of this oversight and all of these institutions, we've still got a high amount of corrupt decision making. I mean, what do we do? But then who knows how much corruption is tolerable? We know that we can't eliminate it, but how do we know how much is tolerable? I mean, certainly we could think about whether the state is captured or not, like South Africa the other day, and the determinants of that are clear. But, the rest of corruption is measured on the basis of perception. Really and truly, it's not something that you can tangibly say that, there's 10% corruption, right? It is mostly, well, how do you think your government is performing? How much corruption do you think is going on in government? Now, here's the issue with that. And it's funny, I was making this point yesterday, and I know that I've kind of answered your question without answering it. But here's the issue. Scandals are really, really interesting, right? So when you hear media reports about things that are going on in public procurement and government contracting, 10 out of 10 times what you're hearing is a scandal. You're not hearing about when organizations do really, really well in the procurement space. You're not hearing about the impact of good procurement contracts on the lives of citizens in particular localities. You're not hearing about the fact that, 40 years ago, we built a bridge and the bridge is still standing. So they did a good job. We don't hear about success stories. So if we're constantly inundated with news about corruption, our perception of corruption will continue to increase. And so we'll continue to build more and more bureaucratic procedures to deal with corruption. So 10 out of 10 for institutions, 10 out of 10 for professionalism, but the patient has still died.
All right, so it's we have to continue to do the work, and see how we can improve. So we have a question from Abby Taylor, but before I go to her, there's a lovely comment from Alana Aguilera who says, excellent presenter, engaging and knowledgeable. Just wanted to share that with you, Andrei.
Thank you.
And there is a question from Sumati Prasad, so I'm going to ask her that, but then I'm going to also ask Andrea, who had Alicia Hackshaw, who asked a question earlier. Alicia is one of our very committed participants who is here all the time. So Alicia, I'm going to ask you to ask your question yourself, right? So you'll unmute and do so. But before we go to you, let me just present this one to Andrei from Sumati Prasad. She said, I had a scenario where we asked for audited financials, but one of the bidders submitted management financials. Will this be considered an item to waiver?
Okay, the first question that I would ask Sumati is, why did you ask for audited financials? What were you going to do with that information? Okay, what were you going to do with it? Is it relevant to your assessment of financial risk? And is that proportionate, right? What's the value of the contract? Will it get you to somewhere? Okay, the second thing is, well, what did you say in the solicitation document? Did you say, I want audited financials that must be, certified by a firm of good repute, etc.? Or did you say, I need to see your financial status or your financial statements? Right? Because if you were unclear about your requirements, then you can't penalize a bidder for submitting something that he thinks is functionally equivalent. But I'm going to conclude on my first point is, if we're looking at substance over form, right? Can you make the risk assessments that you need from the management financials? If you can, and be certain about the validity of that information, then you could make a case. If you can't, then throw the bidder out, because you actually had a good reason for requesting that particular kind of information. That's what it comes back down to. Why are you asking for the thing that you're asking for? If you don't know, don't put it in the document, right? And don't insist on it.
Sorry, I just realized I was on mute. Thank you so much, Andrei. So I want to ask Alicia Hackshaw, if she wants to unmute and then ask her question. Yes, Alicia.
Okay, thanks, Kamala. Andrei, first of all, fantastic presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't think I would have been that interested in public sector procurement, but you started off so well with the history of it. So my question has to do with digitization, and I'll just read out my question for you. So I would expect that the level of bureaucracy would be expected when dealing with public funds, because it's taxpayers' money, of course. But wouldn't increased and effective digitization not assist with not only better timeframes, but also help with the transparency and the integrity of the entire process without negatively affecting the oversight process?
Yeah, absolutely. Alicia, excellent question. And here's the truth. The truth is that people behave better when they know that what they're doing can be seen, right? And so if you have a culture, if you set up procedures that insist on inputting into a digital database that's public, all of the decisions that you've made, and where the public and other people can see every step that you've taken, then you're likely to, make inroads into those decisions that tend to support, unjust enrichment rather than the public good. So yeah, so electronic procurement, doing things in a very digital environment, absolutely helpful in terms of transparency and oversight. In terms of efficiency, right? To the extent that information communications technologies allow for almost instantaneous transfer of information, then absolutely you can get real great gains on time efficiency if you use digital technology or use information technologies. But here's what sometimes happens, and it's something that we see here in Jamaica. So we have an electronic procurement system, and we do quite a lot of our procurement electronically. But what happens sometimes is that people do manual processes using electronic means. So, for example, I worked somewhere once where there was a system that could send out emails to suppliers, right? But here's what my colleague used to do. She used to generate the request in the software, print the request, scan the request back onto her computer, and then use her Outlook to email the request, because she doesn't trust the email setup in the system. So what that eventually did was it converted the electronic tool into something else than it was intended, okay? Now, if you're gonna avoid that in your public procurement, you have to train the people and refresh them constantly, right? Because there is always that level of distrust about systems. And so you don't want to take manual processes and do them using electronic tools. You want to digitize the whole thing and automate the whole thing. All right. So that's how you actually get great gains into efficiency if you use digital tools.
Excellent. That's lean synchronization. That's what we do in procurement, as well as avoiding waste.
Avoiding waste, exactly.
Steps in the process. Exactly. Great. So Abby Taylor, I want to ask you, would you like to unmute your microphone and ask your question of Andrei?
Hi. Sure. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Abby.
Hi, Abby.
You all hearing me?
Yeah.
Hearing you.
Sorry, I'm literally on the go this morning, so I'm calling from my vehicle. Right. So I am the procurement manager at festivals in Tobago, and I'm finding it extremely difficult to not soul select talent, because talent is something unique to an individual. Even though they may have different genres or different types of talent, your talent is unique to yourself. How do I go about putting systems in place so that the procurement of talent is easy? Because right now it's extremely difficult to put value for money on talent.
Abby, there's only one case. Okay, let's start there. I mean, if KES is what you want, because KES is the representation of youth and energy, and it connects with a certain demographic, and you get your message out better that way, etc. Go and get KES, but make sure that in terms of solicitation, sole source him.
Yeah.
What you should do is that you should focus on the constituents of the contract, right? And ensure that KES and his people don't take the government for a ride. Okay, right. So Focus your efforts, therefore, in the contract management phase of procurement rather than the solicitation phase. As far as I'm concerned, when you're procuring talent in that way, it is far more acceptable for you to say, you know, this is only the one person that can do what we want based on what we know of him and his music, so or his art, and therefore we're going to go and get him. But make sure that you focus on the contract and make sure you get the best possible contract. And if the contract can't be properly negotiated, then run, Kez, and go and get somebody else, right? Because at the end of the day, the government must not be taken for a ride. Okay?
Because
that is
I have developed justifications how to go about choosing persons. And for me, sometimes it just comes down to if the person fits the event that we have going on. And once, you know, the price could be able to be negotiated, you know, within our budget. So I didn't know if I was doing the correct thing, because I am a stickler for procedure and following the law or the legislation to a T. But, you know, in some cases, culture, I don't know how culture and procurement could marry well.
So let me just say something quickly, right? I am not seized of the entirety of Trinidadian procurement law. So don't take what I've said as legal advice, right? If you do it and get in trouble, it's not my fault. Okay, but let me tell you what we've done in Jamaica, okay? So in Jamaica, we have a whole schedule of exemptions under our law. So there's covered procurement and non-covered procurement. And amongst the list of non-covered items is goods, works, and services related to the staging of productions in support of or associated with creative expression and cultural events, including but not limited to a whole set of things, and the engagement of artists and performers. So Jamaica has already recognized exactly what you've said, that there's one Bob Marley, there's one Kez, there's one Conscience, there's one Coffee. Right? So, you know, we don't cover those under procurement rules, but we can be taken for a ride. So if those contracts can't be negotiated to mutual benefit, then away with you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, that was an excellent response, Andrei. Thank you so much. You know, it points to the importance of the procurement professional also having that level of ethics as well, because there's always discretion that's called upon to be used from time to time, because not everything can be captured by rules and regulations. So
definitely.
It's 12:30, Andrei. The time has flown. Yes, see how engaging it has been. I want to thank you so much. But let me give you a few minutes of closing remarks, first of all, and then I will ask Nigel if he has anything to add, and we close off our first session for today. Closing remarks, Andrei?
Well, I didn't prepare any closing remarks, but there's that takeaway that I had running through as a thread in my presentation. If we're thinking about doing procurement well, we have to recognize that there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. That means that we have to really, really think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then deploy strategies that will get us to the end goal. If we can get that right, we're going to be the best procurement people ever.